This is Apple's new MacBook Pro with an M4 processor and a matte display. And I wanted to try what it's like to use it as a developer, doing things like using VS Code, Cursor, using AI models in Ollama, as well as things like accessing Docker or virtualizing things for React Native like iOS devices. Let's begin. Here's what unboxing it is like in just a few seconds. Apple's packaging is pretty minimalistic, and it comes with just the laptop and power charger. The machine specs I actually picked out was the Max version with 64 gigs of RAM and a terabyte of storage. On the right side, there's a HDMI port, a Thunderbolt port, and a SD card reader. On the other side, there's a MagSafe, as well as another 2 Thunderbolt ports and a headphone jack. It has the fingerprint scanner on the top right, and the trackpad and keyboard are very similar to previous versions, which is great, since I've always found them very comfortable, especially with the low profile clickability of the keys. What I was excited to test out was the Nano Texture Matte Display. While it costs an additional $150, it reduces distractions from glares and reflections. Here's a comparison with and without the Nano Texture Display, and you can see the reflections of the curtains in the background here as I move the camera. Of course, results may vary. Viewing from a different angle, you might not even notice the difference. However, for someone like me who likes to film, this is definitely a benefit. The Nano Texture definitely plays a bigger part when coding. Since most code editors are in dark mode, you can definitely tell the difference. Now to customize this MacBook Pro M4. Firstly, I always like to enable the path bar in the Finder, so I can always see which folder I'm inside when I'm browsing different paths. Another tool I really like is called Notch Nook, which allows me to have a notch similar to what you find on the iPhone on the MacBook Pro. Then I can customize it to play songs, view my calendar, drag and drop files into AirDrop, or just as a clipboard, and I've generally just found it quite useful. Now to run some AI models and do some performance testing. I'm gonna run Ollama. It's a tool that lets me load up large language models like Llama 3.2 on my MacBook or Windows machine. I want to see how some of the small and large models perform in terms of tokens per second. And I also want to see how it compares to my M2 Max MacBook, which is 16-inch, since both of these are very similar machines besides their screen size. What I found was about double the speed, getting around 66 tokens a second on my M2 and getting around 120 tokens per second on my M4. And to give you a comparison, my Windows machine, which is running a 4019, is able to produce 175 tokens per second. So the MacBook Pro M4 is doing pretty good. The Llama 3.2 model was quite small, so I also tried some larger models to see how they would perform. The M2 MacBook ran at around 7 tokens a second, while the M4 MacBook ran around 16 tokens a second. The next piece of software I installed was Postman. And while I'm pretty sure that the MacBook Pro M4 will be able to run this thing with no problems, it's a pretty important piece of software that I use day to day when I'm trying to test out whether certain API endpoints are working properly. Next, I set up Docker, since a lot of the tools and apps that I'm building these days are often using Docker containers, and it makes the setup process of putting something online or even locally much easier. With Docker up and running now, I'm going to set up Open WebUI as one of the containers. This tool lets me access my large language models in a ChatGPT-like interface. It also comes with lots of features. Setting it up literally means just copy-pasting one terminal command, and there it is. I'm going to test out some of the large and small language models and also check Activity Monitor to see how much usage they're using for both the CPU and memory. What I found was these small models that are 2 billion parameters almost use no memory whatsoever and didn't really hit the resources of the MacBook Pro. But the larger models that are 32 billion did. For example, here it uses up around 20 gigabytes of memory but drops off as soon as you finish using it. Now I want to do some coding. So I'm going to set up GitHub Desktop to copy over some of my projects. I know a lot of people just use Terminal, but the desktop version just makes my life a lot easier. Now to install and set up a VS Code. Visual Studio Code is my favorite IDE, though Cursor is a close competitor. We'll check them out a little bit later. With a VS Code up and running, I'll need to set it up with all my favorite extensions. First is Auto Rename, a great extension that renames tags at the top and bottom of the tag pair. Next is Auto Close, which simply closes the tag that you're currently using and writing, which saves a little bit of time, but it adds up when you're writing lots of code. And finally, GitHub Copilot, because of course I'm going to be using their autocompletes and their chat assistant when I'm writing different bits of code. And now for the coding experience. It's one of my favorites. On the MacBook Pro M4, the keyboard and everything work perfectly, and I could code on this machine all day long. There's just one issue. I've realized I've forgotten to install Node.js. Heading to the website, it's now on version 22, which is incredible. I'm gonna install it along with Yarn since these are the two things that I usually use to install my modules. Unfortunately, this isn't always the best since it seems to have broken all the packages I was using in the past. Next, to do some app development, I'm gonna set up a React Native since one of my projects is using it. It'll also be useful to see how Apple's MacBook Pro M4 handles different types of virtualization for the iOS and Android devices. To get this all running, I'm going to set up Android Studio and set up an emulated device like maybe a Pixel, and then I'll also set up Xcode so that I can run up some emulated iOS devices too. Here in my project, I also have Expo running, and my first app launched successfully. I did need to do some configuring to get the Android app working because the devices weren't launching properly, but after I did that, I got the Android version up and running too. In terms of the performance, when the emulated device launches, then it uses up a lot of CPU, but otherwise they perform quite well, handling the load of both devices running at the same time with minimal effort at around 10%. The memory usage depends on how much you've given for each emulated device. So here I'm using 35 gigs out of my 64, which isn't too bad, and I can definitely see myself using this laptop daily for building applications on the go. There is some more virtualization I wanted to test out, which involves installing Windows 11 on the MacBook Pro. In the past, I would use Boot Camp and have a completely different boot partition for my Windows version, but now using VMware Fusion, which is free for personal use, I can do this in next to no time. While it might seem strange to run Windows on an Apple machine, as a programmer, it's always useful to be able to test on different devices and browsers when you're building applications, and this is one of the best ways I've found to do so. And since this M4 processor and the amount of RAM I have on this device is ridiculous, I feel like I can pretty much emulate every device without much drawback. With such a powerful machine, it's always good to have a little bit of fun as well. So I wanted to try out what gaming is like on the MacBook Pro. Since this machine technically has a 14-core CPU and a 32-core GPU, I would expect it to be a powerhouse, but that still isn't the case. Drivers or games just don't run as well as they do on PC. And while the App Store and the arcade options from Apple are great, it still doesn't have some of my favorite games, such as Counter-Strike or Valorant. Now to get back to being serious. I want to do some web design, and I'm gonna do this on Figma. And I've set up my iPad here as a second monitor wirelessly using Sidecar. This allows me to have Figma on one screen and then the code or the project I'm working on the other. I'm looking at doing a redesign for my community website Merge. I've been using this design for the last year or two, and I think it's time for a refresh. Also, I've never really had any performance issues with Figma, so if you're a designer just using it like this, then you probably don't need a Max machine. Once I'm finished with my design, I head over to Wix Studio to build the website. I've been working on this one for the last year or two, so it's already one that I've developed quite a lot. Having your own website is pretty important. It's like a portfolio. Another thing that I'm trying to keep up to date is my blog, which I'm trying to post weekly. I've also got a course I'm putting together, and it's going to be all about AI and how to create websites without writing any lines of code, since AI tools these days let you do everything from create sitemaps to the entire designs themselves. Next, I wanted to test out the MacBook Pro M4 for video. Since I do a lot of video editing for this YouTube channel, I'm often throwing things into Adobe Premiere and scrubbing through a timeline as well as rendering out different types of videos. This seems to perform better than my Windows machine, especially with scrubbing, which often lags when I'm using it on my computer, whereas on the MacBook Pro, well, it just seems to scrub through flawlessly. I also set up a test to render a very similar video on both my Windows machine, which has a 4090, as well as the MacBook M2 and the MacBook M4. Here are the results. First place was still my PC, which runs a 4090 and rendered a 6-minute scene in about 1:40. Second place was the MacBook M4, which rendered the same scene in about 2 minutes and 10 seconds. And in last place was the M2 16-inch, which took about 2 minutes 40 to render that same scene. The main takeaway here is that the M4 is definitely good for editing and comes close to some of the top-end PCs for rendering. So here are my final thoughts on the M4 Max. It delivered on pretty much every capability, from coding to running AI models to video editing and even web design, which doesn't even need that much power. In comparison to the M2, which is what I was using in the past, it's still a powerhouse, but this thing can do everything that this large device did, but faster and more efficiently. It also means that it's a little bit lighter in my backpack, since the 14-inch isn't as heavy as the 16-inch, which I was using in the past. But I'm excited to see how it all goes. I'll give you guys an update in about half a year to a year to tell you more or less how my experience has been with this machine now moving forward.